What's up, YouTube? My name is Jeff, photographer with what I like to call Boosted Optics, photography company that I'm building, specializing in automotive photography, soon to be videography. Really enjoy some other aspects of photography, street photos, engagement sessions, senior portraits, family photos, things like that. So look for plenty more to come as we continue and grow. This being my first video, not sure really what to expect, but I had some questions from a photographer friend of mine, good buddy named Nick, who is also with his own company, Parks Media. Link in the description for his Instagram profile. Does some amazing work, but of course photography is super subjective and everybody has a different style. So we were having a conversation, and he wanted me to look at some things a little bit differently on how I would. So I said, hey, let me do a quick little edit video on how I edit a photo. Had him send over a raw file. We actually used the same type of camera. We're both shooting with the Canon EOS R6. He uses a EF 24-70 F2.8. I primarily either use a Sigma 35mm 1.4 or the Canon new RF 70-200 f2.8. With that, this is actually a photo that he took recently that I'm just working with him, showing how I make things pop. This is also a great tutorial for people that may have some questions regarding editing white vehicles. Some people seem to struggle, others love them. My personal vehicle is white, so I feel like I have it nailed down. But anyway, more videos to come. Hopefully this is something that I can do on a regular basis. I'd love to get to a point where I have, the ability to have people send in examples of, their own work and, what twist that I could put on them. But with that, I'll get right into the actual edit process, and you guys can actually follow along and see what I do, how I approach a picture. I'm fairly new, so some of this may be obvious to you. Some of you may think that I'm doing it wrong. All sorts of things. But the cool thing, again, photography is subjective. What you like, I may not. What I like, you may not. But that said, certainly appreciate any constructive criticism, anything that you think could make my personal workflow easier. Certainly happy to, try new things and learn along the way as well. So with that said, put the picture up here. It's a beautiful white Audi A6. Has a few things done to it. Too long to list. I certainly can put that in the description if anybody's interested. Certainly leave a comment below, and I'm sure my friend wouldn't mind sharing. But as we get started, of course, just in the standard develop panel here, very first thing that I do, knowing that this primary focus is going to be for Instagram, I go ahead and I just crop it with a 4:5 aspect ratio, knowing that that's what seems to work best when it comes to Instagram. So we've got that 4:5 rectangle on there. I'm going to bring it in just a little bit. One of the things that I do, as we do this, of course, Instagram and your profile grid, the car really should be pretty close to center. So I take a look at that. This up here in your upper left, I find super helpful to kind of give you a preview for what it's going to look like in a grid. It's also pretty easy to tell if it's center or a little off or straight, so on and so forth. This photo is pretty straight, it seems. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that crop. As we go down, I generally don't play with the white balance too much unless I think it's super off. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this as shot. Then you just start working your way down. I may bump the exposure just a little bit on this. Of course, with that, generally, if I up the exposure on anything, I will add just a little bit of contrast back in. So we go down the highlights, of course. With the car being white, you have to kind of be careful. Otherwise, as you can see, end up with a gray car. So I try to bring it down to just a reasonable level. The car's still white, but you're getting a little bit more of the detail in there. And I also just got a new MacBook Pro, and the trackpad is huge and not liking me. But as you can see, I'm trying to retain some of the detail here in the hood. That's can be difficult in white cars, but depends how the picture was taken. Shadows, typically speaking, I don't start adjusting shadows too much in the actual photo because I get more into it when we're looking at the car, and I'll show you that momentarily. Again, you can look at white levels. If you pay attention into your histogram on the top right here, it actually will tell you when you are either crushing your whites or crushing your blacks. So I try to pay attention to that. If you see, we bring the blacks down, and apparently that's not going to work for my demo, but that's okay. But again, given just a little bit more contrast in the image. So from here, we're dealing with texture and clarity. Again, typically speaking, I'm going to do these adjustments more to the specific subject, or in this case, the vehicle, as opposed to the whole image. It gives a little bit softer feel to the background, and we can make the car really kind of pop out a little bit more. Dehaze, again, working with the white and black levels and the amount of contrast that's in the image. Typically, again, on the image itself, I'll leave that pretty much alone. I also like to just desaturate a little bit. This is a tip that I believe that I actually learned. Well, you know what? I won't quote it because I'm not sure. But with that, we can go down later in the individual colors and, put back saturation in the colors that we want. Being that it's a white car and it doesn't have any accents, we may not do a whole bunch with that, but for instance, I have red accents on my car. I always go and boost the reds back up, or if there's a specific color in the background that I'm excited about, I can go through and tweak that later. When you get into the tone curve, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit new and experimental with this, but of course you have your shadows, and again, I'll just generally play with that until I see what I like. You get into your darks, and again, just kind of keeping that. You end up with kind of a traditional S-curve, or at least I do as I'm going through some of this stuff. And again, I'm just really watching the color on the car here to make sure that I don't completely lose everything. So boost that just a little bit at the top. So when we go down, we have our hue and saturation. I like to look at it like this and adjust things individually. You can go through, we can mess with the greens, for example. I don't think, because most of the tree's dead, but you can see I can boost up the greens in that in the trees just a little bit by looking at that hue. And if I were to go into the saturation, I could probably bring just a little bit back in. It's not much, but little things make a difference as we go through. I could go through oranges and yellows would probably make a difference on the grass here. So if I wanted to be just a little bit more oranges, I certainly wanted to look natural, but it doesn't look as bad there, I don't feel like. Typically speaking, I'm not changing it on a white vehicle anyway, any hue with the aqua blue, purple, or magenta. I would, however, go through and change things in the saturation, and I'll explain that in a minute. But going through with the colors that we're dealing with the orange and the yellows that I did, so if I wanted to boost that up a little bit, I could. And then the yellows. We've got the greens where we set. So aqua and blue, and this is where a white car is easy depending on your background and what you're trying to retain. Most of your glare that you're ever going to get in your windshield is going to be in either aqua or blue. So if you look at the windshield, if I go all the way up, you see the aqua that's reflected in that. Because there's no blue sky in this or anything else, I'm actually going to turn aqua all the way down. And if we go into blue, you can see how the blue actually is reflecting off the paint. I tend to go all the way desaturated on the blue as well. Even in the situation where there's skies, I think that it's a neat effect and a neat look. Not everybody's going to agree with that. That's kind of become my style. I've started putting a little bit back in certain situations. Again, it's just going to depend on what you like. purple and magenta, great, depending on the lens you're using, if there's any chromatic aberration, if there's any purple fringing along the DRLs or anything like that that you see, it's easy, you can take that out. This image looks pretty clean as I go through here and just look. I don't see any kind of fringing, and I shouldn't. It was a L series lens that took this, but sometimes you'll get just a little bit around the headlights and such. Depending on the polarizer you're using, on headlight lenses and such, you'll see there's a little bit of green in here, and we could probably brush that out if we really wanted to, but for the sake of Instagram, I don't think it's necessary in this case. So last thing, of course, would be luminance. So how bright something is. We talked about green in those bushes and back, and this isn't going to do a whole lot for them because, again, they're just not that green. But perhaps a better example, if you look at the grass and the orange, as I adjust those, you can kind of see what it's doing. Same thing with yellows. And then the interesting thing is, even though we've desaturated blue, if you notice, because the blue reflects off the paint so much, we can actually look at the brightness of the car just by adjusting the luminance of the blue. And then same thing with aqua. So if we want that windshield to be a little bit darker, for instance, we can drag the luminance of aqua down and get that just a little bit darker. Color grading, I'm still very much experimenting with. I generally start with highlights and shadows and worry about midtones last. I tend to go warmer on things. With that, again, you can get real carried away real fast, and this actually is probably the disadvantage in having a white car, is it's really difficult to make any kind of significant change with this without getting a bunch of weird color cast on the car. So I'm just going to go just a tiny bit with orange there, and then generally the shadows, I'll go just a little bit on the cooler side. And again, the goal is just, what you think looks good without it being too crazy or too terribly much. And then midtones, again, I generally stick on the warmer side of things. So that's about where I would leave it. You can go then and adjust the brightness, if you will, of the midtones, highlights, shadows. You can go through and control that individually here. You can also then control how they're blending, so how much highlights versus shadows there are and such. So I go through and I look at this and I just find something that I make looks good. This is the advantage, and as we get to the end of this, I am going to create a preset. So as you go through and you spend the time and you edit one image on this set, let's say, and you have more, you can just easily save a preset or even copy and paste the settings to do the rest of your images on the set. So we go down to detail in the sharpening. So if you'll notice, there's an amount, a radius, detail. Typically speaking, I leave these at their default values. However, I look at the masking. If you hold down Option on a Mac or Control, I believe, on a PC, and you move the slider, you can see then what is being sharpened. Of course, we don't necessarily need to sharpen the whole image. We just want to sharpen those lines. So we get this to a point where we can see the edges of the car are being sharpened, not the whole rest of the image. Noise reduction, both luminance and color. In this particular case, we were at ISO 100. I don't see a whole lot of noise when it comes to the actual image itself. We haven't pulled shadows up a lot, so I'll revisit this in a minute when we get to the car adjustment. But overall, that's pretty much where I stop. If you wanted to add a vignette, darken it up a little bit, you certainly could. I'm not going to do that, not at least yet, maybe at the end. And then if you really want to get into it, you can of course get in and you can start adjusting different calibration if you wanted to, tweak it just a little bit further. You can go through, but typically speaking, I leave those where they're at. So if you're not familiar already with the new AI masking tools in Adobe Lightroom, I strongly suggest you go check out some other YouTubers and their reviews on how to use these features, because they are absolutely life-changing when it comes to photo editing, whether it's cars, people, landscapes, whatever the case may be. They are just awesome. in this particular case, because I have the image pretty much where that I want it, but the car is still a little bit flat to me in the image, we can go through, we can select our subject. It's going to automatically detect our subject, in this case the car. There's a little outside of it, but nothing obnoxious that I think is going to really make a difference in our photo. But if we didn't want a certain section, we could simply go in, I just zoom in a little bit, and we could actually subtract and use a brush, and we could just brush some of this away so it wasn't part of that mask. And then anything that you see here that's highlighted in red is ultimately what's going to get changed by the settings that we're about to do. So I use just a smaller brush to get the outline, and then we'll just use a little bigger brush. And this can be done now, it can be done after. So if you were to make changes, I wouldn't have done this. I would have just made the changes, and if something looked goofy, I would have used this brush to deselect it afterwards. But with that said, that's how you would do it. I'm not going to worry about the sky. You'll see at the end of this that it looks perfectly fine. So once you start adjusting this red goes away. So now if we're doing exposure adjustments or whatnot, obviously that's an extreme example, but it's only affecting the subject in the image, in this case the car. I'm pretty happy with where the exposure is at on this. Typically speaking, I'm going to bump up shadows a bit, pull out some detail in the grill. So if we zoom in on this, we don't want to go too much, but you know, there at least, you know, this is just black mush. This here, at least we're getting a little bit of detail in the grill. I certainly don't want it to look gray, so this is where I can look and we can adjust blacks just a little bit. See, we're still retaining the detail, but it's still black. From here, I'll generally bump up texture just a hair to where I like it. This can be a personal preference. A lot of people say, oh, this is an overdone thing, whatever the case may be. I think this is what makes my images pop and what looks good to me. Clarity is another thing that you can do, and you can adjust depending on the effect that you're going for. I generally don't go super crazy. Again, you know, these numbers aren't a ton. It's just enough to get that car to really kind of pop. The rest of the stuff I typically leave alone because I've done it in the rest of my image. And you'll have to forgive me because the rest of my light went off. There we go. So at this point, I have the car where I want the car to be. There's just a few other things that I would do. So the other thing, of course, is to bring that attention to the car. That's absolutely not what I wanted to do, so I will just delete that mask entirely. All right. So if we make a linear gradient, typically speaking, I just drag up a little from the bottom. I'm actually going to move this down just a bit and stretch it out so it's not quite as intense. And then I'll go through and just bring down the exposure just a little bit. And then depending, sometimes you can do that in the sky. In this case, I don't think I'm going to. I am just going to try something though. There is a select sky adjustment, and we'll get to that in another image where I have a big sky. But you'll notice that just selected the sky. Sometimes, depending on what's back there and such, dehaze can do some cool stuff. I find more so than exposure or anything else that you do. In this case, that sky's pretty much gone. There isn't any detail there, so we are not going to worry about it. From here, again, I think this is a pretty solid image. It's nice, it's clean, it's crisp. I think he did a great job for a front end shot. It has the tweaks that I would do to it, and I would call it a day. If you wanted to increase, you know, the center point just a little bit more, you could add a little vignette, but I'd probably leave it just like that. So it's barely, if anything, there. From there, it's done. That's going to be the final image, and that's what you'll get. So I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial. I have a couple more images that I'm going to do, but I think for time's sake, I'm actually going to do those in separate videos. But for the moment, thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, please like and subscribe. I look forward to seeing you guys soon. And of course, drop a comment below, any comments, thoughts, suggestions. If you hate it, that's fine too. You can leave that as well. Appreciate y'all watching. Until next time.